finally home. I had just moved back from Johannesburg, South Africa, where I had been living for 2 years. Thanksgiving was a few days away, and I was sitting on the couch with my dad, watching the news coming out of Ferguson. Michael Brown was dead, and they had just decided not to indict Darren Wilson, not even give him a trial. What? My dad looked at me and he said, "What did you expect to happen? I mean, if it was dark and a black guy came at me with something in his hand and a hood on, I could have done the same thing." I stood up, shaking, and I looked at my dad. And before I ran out of the room, I said, "You are a racist." I didn't understand how my dad could have said that. His dad was a Dixiecrat defense lawyer like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He had spent his whole life fighting for justice and equality. That was the reason why I had gone on to study racism as an American Studies major in college at the University of Virginia. But the racism that I studied was an extreme. Slave owners were racist. Ku Klux Klan members were racist. Separate but equal, racist. But me, my family, we were good. So how had I just called my dad a racist? Conflicted, I needed to figure it out. And what I learned is that racism is not black and white. It is not binary. Instead, it is a spectrum, and we are all wired to be on it. But when we talk about racism, we put up walls. So to take those walls down today, we're going to coin a new term. We're going to call it ODD, Other Deficit Disorder. With a deficit of the other in our lives, we have a disorder that causes us to unintentionally avoid, discriminate, and harm. This is how we're wired. We get ODD from two sources: direct experience and indirect exposure to stereotypes. When I reflected on my ODD, I realized that I started when I was 5. Now, I was about to start school, and I was still sucking my thumb. And my mom, who's here in the audience, is probably still embarrassed. She was horrified. So she consulted her brother-in-law, my Uncle Robert, and he had a solution. You see, Uncle Robert was Chinese, and he had a secret potion that he painted on both of my thumbs that made them taste like rotting Brussels sprouts. From that moment, I hated Uncle Robert. And from my limited 5-year-old perspective, I didn't know any other Chinese people, so I thought that all Chinese people were bad and should be avoided. And this sounds silly, but 20 years later, I looked around, and I still didn't have any close Chinese friends. This is how we're wired. This is made even worse every day by the indirect stereotypes that we absorb. In American media, for example, black men play violent roles 56% of the time, while white men play them only 11%. Asian men, on the other hand, are often portrayed as effeminate nerds. But why? It goes back to 1850 San Francisco, when 4,000 Chinese immigrants flooded into the city, and only 2 were women. White men felt threatened by these new eligible bachelors, and so they used political cartoons to brand them as effeminate, making fun of them for doing girly work, even though those were the only jobs available. As a result, the American public came to expect Asian men who might be good at math, but not at wooing women. All because white men 150 years ago were afraid of losing their ladies. This is how we're wired. Now, I mentioned that I studied racism in college. But while I spent afternoons in the library getting all fired up about the injustice of separate but equal, I came home to a different kind. I was in a sorority in college. I was actually president of my sorority in college. And I know a lot of you are already bringing negative stereotypes in to make judgments about me, but we won't talk about that today. But aside from all of the negatives, there are a lot of positives too. And one of the positives is that you get to live with all of your best friends all the time. But when I think back to that house of 146 people, there was only one person of color, Lamont, our cook. We hadn't tried to keep the other out, but we had tried to bring people like us in. The result is discrimination. And you don't lose that bias when you're looking for friends, looking to hire someone, or looking for a life partner. This is how we're wired. Even more dangerous than discrimination, though, is unintentional harm. Stanford psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt studies implicit racial bias and its impact on our behavior. In one study, she showed participants images of either black men or white men, and then fuzzy images of objects that slowly became clear. As a result, when the objects were crime-related and participants had been shown images of black men, they were able to identify them that much faster. Eberhardt's work suggests that we are culturally conditioned to associate black men with crime. So my dad may have been right about the impact that culture had on him. We are all wired with ODD. And asking yourself, where am I on this spectrum, is a really hard question to ask. Because the answer often hurts. When I talk about this, I feel sad, and I feel a tremendous amount of shame. But when I'm able to separate myself, who I am, from the mistakes I've made and the mistakes that were made before me, I feel empowered. And the most important message I have for you today is that no matter how we're wired on this spectrum, we have an opportunity to do some rewiring. The turning point for me came when I moved to South Africa. And when you start talking about it, it's okay to say, I'm white, you're black. It's not just okay, it's necessary. Because when we tiptoe around the topics the way we do here, we give them power. By saying nothing, the only thing you're doing is making sure that nothing changes. What if instead we stayed open, we're curious, ask questions, and if we're uncomfortable, as we will be, it's okay, say we're uncomfortable. And then ask anyway. Because once we start the conversation, then we can actually start to build the relationships that rewire racism. When I arrived at African Leadership Academy to teach in Johannesburg, I had created a situation accidentally in which I had become the other. So much so that my students nicknamed me La Blanche. As if I couldn't crack that code. But after a few weeks at ALA, that African other became Nigerian, Rwandan, Senegalese, Kenyan individuals. And when you can see diversity within an other racial group, it becomes really hard to hold on to the stereotypes that you came in with. That African other became some of my closest friends, who I still talk to daily. Because when you're able to find common ground that's deeper than the color of your skin, you're able to make connections that last longer, too. This is a process. This is a hard process. This is a long process. This is something I'm still working on. I'm still working on rewiring the ODD that I developed as a child by building a relationship with my roommate here at Stanford, who is full of joy, a fantastic cook, looks awesome in hats, and is Chinese. She just happens to be a little bit nicer than Uncle Robert was to me. I'm still working on this. We all have ODD. But when we stop accepting what others have shaped for us and start shaping it ourselves, then we can rewire racism. Thank you.